His last request before the execution was to see his dog, but what happened shocked everyone. The clock on the wall read 5:45 p.m. 15 minutes until Samuel Mitchell would take his final breath. In 15 years on death row, he'd never asked for anything. No special meal, no final phone call, no priest. But today was different. "I want to see my dog," Sam whispered to Warden James Crawford through the steel bars. "Blue, he's all I got left in this world," Crawford frowned. In 30 years of corrections, he'd never heard such a request. "Son, that's not how this works. Please." Sam's weathered hands gripped the bars. "That dog's been waiting for me for 15 years. Outside the prison walls, an old German shepherd with clouded eyes sat patiently in a veterinarian's truck. Blue hadn't eaten in 3 days. Somehow he knew what happened next would prove that sometimes the truth has 4 legs and a tail. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Samuel Sam Mitchell hadn't always been prisoner number 47821. 15 years ago, he was Dr. Samuel Mitchell, Army veterinarian, devoted to healing wounded military dogs and strays that nobody else would touch. His calloused hands had saved hundreds of 4-legged lives, but they couldn't save him from the night that changed everything. Blue came into Sam's life on a rain-soaked evening in March 2008. Sam was driving home from the VA clinic when he spotted the German Shepherd puppy, no more than 8 weeks old, shivering beside the railroad tracks. The little guy's hind leg was mangled, probably from trying to escape a moving freight train. Most folks would have called it a lost cause. "Well, I'll be jiggered," Sam had muttered, scooping up the whimpering pup. "What kind of fool leaves a baby like you out here?" That night in his makeshift clinic behind his trailer, Sam worked for 6 hours straight to save that leg. Blue never left his side afterward. Where Sam went, Blue followed. When Sam treated wounded dogs from the military base, Blue would sit quietly nearby, as if understanding the sacred nature of healing work. Detective Carl Morrison was cut from different cloth entirely. At 58, Morrison had spent 30 years in law enforcement, but somewhere along the way his moral compass had gotten twisted. Gambling debts and a taste for the high life had corrupted what might have once been an honest cop. His father, Frank Morrison, owned half the commercial properties in Millfield County, including some that operated in shadows the law couldn't quite reach. Morrison's rise through the ranks came with a price. Every promotion required looking the other way, every commendation built on someone else's silence. By 2008, he was the kind of cop who made good men nervous and bad men comfortable. Judge William Bill Hawthorne represented the old guard of Southern justice. At 65, he'd presided over thousands of cases with fairness and dignity. His white hair and gentle demeanor masked a sharp legal mind that had sent many guilty men to prison and freed several innocent ones. Hawthorne believed in the system, trusted that truth would always surface if given proper chance. Dr. Peterson, the 70-year-old veterinarian who'd become Blue's caretaker, was Sam's oldest friend. They'd served together in Desert Storm, patching up military dogs under enemy fire. Peterson understood the bond between a man and his dog better than most understood marriage. The town of Millfield, Georgia, was the kind of place where everybody knew your business before you did. Churches outnumbered bars 3-1, and a man's reputation mattered more than his bank account. It was also the kind of place where secrets festered in the humid summer air, and where one corrupt family could poison an entire community for generations. On that fateful October night in 2008, all these lives would collide in ways none of them could have imagined. October 13, 2008, started like any other Tuesday for Sam Mitchell. The Georgia autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke as he loaded his veterinary supplies into his beat-up Ford pickup. Blue, now a magnificent 2-year-old German Shepherd, jumped into the passenger seat with practiced ease, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the road ahead. The call came in around 7:30 p.m. from Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, her voice shaking over the crackling phone line. "Dr. Mitchell, there's been some kind of accident down by the Morrison warehouse. Found 3 dogs hurt real bad. One's barely breathing." Sam's jaw tightened. The Morrison warehouse district was known for more than legitimate business. Whispers around town spoke of illegal activities that happened after dark, but Frank Morrison's money and influence kept most folks from asking too many questions. "I'll be right there, Mrs. Pritchard." "Keep them warm and still." The drive to the warehouse took 20 minutes through Millfield's winding back roads. Blue sat alert in the passenger seat, occasionally whining as if sensing something wrong in the air. As they approached the industrial district, Sam noticed an unusual number of expensive cars parked in shadows between buildings. The first injured dog, a pit bull mix, lay bleeding from what looked like bite wounds. The second, a smaller terrier, had a broken leg. But it was the third dog that made Sam's stomach turn. The German Shepherd, barely older than Blue, had been beaten so severely that Sam wasn't sure she'd survive the night. "Jesus Christ," Sam whispered, kneeling beside the wounded animal. "What kind of monster does this to a defenseless creature?" Blue sniffed around the area, his hackles raised. He'd found something that made him growl low in his throat, a sound Sam had never heard from his gentle companion. That's when Frank Morrison appeared from the shadows. At 62, Frank Morrison was a man who'd grown fat on other people's misery. His expensive suit couldn't hide the cruelty in his pale eyes or the bourbon on his breath. Behind him stood 2 younger men Sam didn't recognize, their faces hard as concrete. "Well, well," Morrison drawled, his voice carrying the false charm of a snake oil salesman. "Dr. Do-Good himself. Somebody call you about these mutts?" Sam stood slowly, his hands still bloody from examining the wounded shepherd. "These dogs need immediate medical attention. What happened here?" Morrison's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Just some business entertainment that got a little out of hand. Boys like to see a good fight, you know how it is." "Dog fighting." Sam's voice was flat, stating fact rather than asking a question. "You're running illegal dog fights. Now that's a serious accusation, Doc." Morrison stepped closer, and Sam caught the metallic scent of gun oil beneath the bourbon. "Might be the kind of accusation that gets a man in trouble if he ain't careful." Blue moved between Sam and Morrison, his lips pulling back to show white teeth. The dog's instincts were screaming danger, and Sam trusted Blue's judgment more than most people's. "I'm taking these dogs to get treatment," Sam said firmly. "Then I'm calling the sheriff." Morrison's face darkened. "I don't think you understand the situation here, Doc. See, what happens at my property stays at my property, and folks who don't respect that arrangement tend to have accidents." "Are you threatening me, Morrison?" "I'm explaining facts of life. Your little clinic operates on county land, don't it? County controlled by the Morrison family for 3 generations. Would be a shame if your permits got revoked." "Even worse shame if something happened to that pretty dog of yours." Blue's growl deepened, and Sam felt his own anger rising. "You lay one finger on my dog, or what?" Morrison reached into his jacket, and Sam caught a glimpse of a shoulder holster. "You'll what exactly?" The tension stretched like a guitar string about to snap. Sam's mind raced, calculating options. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and miles from help. But he couldn't leave these wounded animals, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let Morrison intimidate him into silence. "I'll do what's right," Sam said quietly. "Same as I always have." Morrison's eyes went dead cold. "Yeah, I figured you'd say something stupid like that." The sound of gunshots echoed through the warehouse district at 9:47 p.m., according to later police reports. By the time sheriff's deputies arrived, Frank Morrison lay dead in a pool of blood, and Sam Mitchell was kneeling beside the wounded dogs, his hands covered in their blood, and his service pistol missing from its holster. Blue sat beside his master, trembling not from fear, but from what he'd witnessed. The dog's keen senses had recorded every sight, sound, and smell of that terrible night. But Blue was just a dog, and dogs couldn't testify in court. At least that's what everyone believed. The arrest came at dawn. Sam was still in his clinic, working desperately to save the beaten German shepherd when sheriff's deputies surrounded his property. Blue started barking before the first patrol car turned into the gravel driveway, his ears pricked and body tense with an anxiety Sam had never seen before. "Samuel Mitchell, you're under arrest for the murder of Frank Morrison," announced Deputy Chief Carl Morrison, his voice carrying an odd mixture of grief and satisfaction. The dead man's son had arrived with a full tactical team, as if Sam might resist with violent force. Sam looked up from the operating table, his hands still inside the wounded dog's chest cavity. "I need 10 more minutes to stabilize her. She'll die if I stop now. Step away from the table now." Morrison's hand rested on his service weapon. "The animals are evidence in a murder investigation." "Evidence?" Sam's voice cracked with disbelief. "These dogs are victims, not evidence. They need medical care." Blue positioned himself between Sam and the advancing officers, not aggressively but protectively. The dog's intelligent eyes seemed to understand that something terrible was happening to his master. During the 3-hour interrogation that followed, Sam maintained his innocence while Detective Morrison and District Attorney Patricia Wells built their case. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Sam's gun was missing. Witnesses placed him at the scene, and gunshot residue tests came back positive. "Your service pistol killed my father," Morrison said, leaning across the metal table. "We found it in the creek behind the warehouse, wiped clean but with your prints on the grip." Sam's mind reeled. He'd carried that Colt .45 for 20 years, a gift from his father when he'd enlisted. "I didn't shoot anybody. My gun was stolen from my truck 3 days ago. I filed a report." "Convenient story." Wells shuffled through her papers with the efficiency of a seasoned prosecutor. "Dr. Mitchell, you were caught red-handed at a crime scene with the victim's blood on your hands and your murder weapon nearby. The only question is whether you planned this or if it happened in the heat of the moment." "The blood on my hands was from the dogs," Sam insisted. "Frank Morrison was running illegal dog fights. I confronted him about it, yes, but I never threatened violence." Morrison's laugh was bitter. "My father was a pillar of this community, a successful businessman, church deacon, and charitable donor. You expect people to believe he was involved in criminal activity?" The trial began 6 weeks later in the Millfield County Courthouse, a building that had stood since 1887 and witnessed more than its share of Southern justice. Judge William Hawthorne presided with his characteristic fairness, but even his experienced eye couldn't penetrate the web of lies that had been spun around the case. Sarah Beth Collins, Sam's overworked public defender, did her best with limited resources. At 28, she was bright and dedicated, but woefully outmatched by the prosecution's unlimited budget and political connections. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said during opening statements, "the evidence will show that Dr. Samuel Mitchell is a healer, not a killer. This man has dedicated his life to saving animals that others would abandon. Does that sound like someone capable of cold-blooded murder?" District Attorney Wells painted a different picture. The defendant had means, motive, and opportunity. He was angry about alleged animal cruelty. He carried a weapon, and he was found at the scene with the victim's blood on his hands. "This isn't about character. It's about facts." Blue was brought to court as a therapy animal for Sam, a small mercy that Judge Hawthorne allowed despite prosecution objections. The dog's behavior during the trial was strange and troubling. Whenever Detective Morrison testified, Blue would become agitated, whining and pacing despite his usual calm demeanor. "Your Honor," Morrison said during his testimony, "that animal is disrupting the proceedings. It should be removed from the courtroom." Judge Hawthorne studied Blue's reaction carefully. "The dog seems calm, except when you're speaking, Detective. Perhaps you could testify from a different position in the courtroom." But moving Morrison didn't help. Blue continued his anxious behavior, staring at the detective with an intensity that made several jurors uncomfortable. Mrs. Doris Hendricks, sitting in the front row, whispered to her neighbor, "That dog knows something we don't." The prosecution's case seemed airtight. 3 witnesses testified they'd heard Sam threatening Morrison. Dr. Richard Reynolds, the medical examiner, confirmed that Morrison had been killed by a single shot from Sam's service weapon. The gunshot residue evidence was damning. "Dr. Reynolds," Sarah Beth asked during cross-examination, "in your professional opinion, how long after firing a weapon would gunshot residue remain on someone's hands?" "Several hours, depending on conditions," Reynolds replied, avoiding eye contact with the defense attorney. "And if someone handled a recently fired weapon without actually firing it themselves, that could also leave residue, yes." It was a small crack in the prosecution's case, but not enough to create reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with their verdict. "We find the defendant, Samuel Mitchell, guilty of murder in the first degree." Sam felt the courtroom spin around him. Blue began howling, a sound that echoed through the 100-year-old building like a funeral dirge. Judge Hawthorne, his face grave with the weight of what he had to do, pronounced the sentence that everyone expected. "Samuel Mitchell, you have been found guilty of the murder of Frank Morrison. This court sentences you to death by lethal injection." As the bailiffs led Sam away in shackles, Blue broke free from Dr. Peterson's grip and ran to his master. The dog pressed against Sam's legs, whimpering with a desperation that broke hearts throughout the courtroom. "Take care of him, Doc," Sam whispered as guards pulled him toward the door. "And if anything ever happens to me, remember what he saw that night. Blue knows the truth." Those words would echo in Dr. Peterson's mind for the next 15 years. The first year was the hardest. Blue refused to eat for 3 weeks after Sam's conviction, his once bright eyes growing dull with grief that seemed to consume his entire being. Dr. Peterson tried everything: hand-feeding, changing food brands, even bringing in other dogs for companionship. But Blue would only take enough nourishment to survive. "That dog's grieving just like a person would," Peterson told his wife, Martha, as they watched Blue lying motionless in the kennel. "I've seen military dogs do this when their handlers get killed overseas. Sometimes they just give up." But Blue didn't give up. Something strange began happening around the 6-month mark. The dog started exhibiting behaviors that Peterson had never seen in 40 years of veterinary practice. Blue would dig holes in specific locations around Peterson's property, always returning to bury small objects he'd found, bits of fabric, bottle caps, even pebbles that seemed to have no significance. "Maybe he's just bored," Martha suggested, but Peterson wasn't convinced. There was an intelligence in Blue's actions, a purposefulness that suggested something more complex than simple canine restlessness. The weekly visits to see Sam were Blue's only moments of true animation. The Georgia Department of Corrections had initially refused to allow the visits, but Sarah Beth Collins had fought for them as part of a compassionate release program for inmates with therapy animals. Blue wasn't officially certified, but his bond with Sam was undeniable. 15 minutes, the guard would say each Tuesday afternoon, leading Blue through the maximum security facility to the visiting room. The dog knew the routine by heart, through 3 sets of steel doors, past the metal detectors, down the corridor that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Sam would be waiting behind the reinforced glass, his prison jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame that grew thinner each month. When Blue saw his master, the transformation was remarkable. The listless dog would become alert, pressing against the glass and whining with joy. "Hey there, old boy," Sam would say, placing his palm against the glass where Blue's paw rested. "You taking care of Doc Peterson for me?" Blue would respond with soft barks and head tilts, as if answering in a language only the two of them understood. But these visits began to reveal something troubling. Blue's eyesight appeared to be failing rapidly. By the third year, the dog was bumping into walls and furniture, his once confident gait becoming hesitant and uncertain. Cataracts, Peterson diagnosed, sadly. Common in older German shepherds, but Blue's developing them unusually early. "I'm afraid he'll be completely blind within a few years." The news devastated Sam. During their visits, he would watch Blue struggle to navigate the visiting room, his heart breaking for the loyal companion who'd already sacrificed so much. But even as Blue's vision failed, his other senses seemed to sharpen. The dog could identify people by their footsteps from remarkable distances, and his reaction to certain individuals became increasingly pronounced. Detective Morrison, now chief of police, occasionally visited the prison on official business. On those days, Blue's behavior was nothing short of extraordinary. The dog would become agitated hours before Morrison arrived, pacing and whining with an anxiety that bordered on panic. When Morrison finally appeared, Blue would position himself as far away as possible, his ears flattened and body trembling. "That dog's got good instincts," observed Tommy Ray Henderson, a prison guard who'd started working at the facility during Sam's 5th year. Henderson was a quiet man in his 30s with kind eyes and a gentle way with both inmates and animals. Unlike many guards, he seemed to genuinely care about rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Henderson had grown up knowing Frank Morrison's reputation around town, though he'd never spoken publicly about what his late mother had told him in private. She'd worked as a cleaning lady at Morrison's warehouse for years, coming home with stories about late-night meetings and the sound of dogs fighting in the building's basement. "Mr. Henderson," she'd whispered on her deathbed, "that man's got darkness in him. The things I seen, the things I heard. God forgive me, I should have spoke up." But Henderson had been just a teenager then, and speaking against the Morrison family was career suicide in Millfield County. Now, watching Blue's reaction to Chief Morrison, he began to wonder if his mother's suspicions had been correct. As the years passed, Blue's blindness became more pronounced, but so did his intelligence. Dr. Peterson noticed that the dog had developed an uncanny ability to find lost objects. When Peterson misplaced his reading glasses, Blue would lead him directly to them. When a neighbor's cat went missing, Blue found it trapped in a storm drain 3 blocks away. "It's like he's got some kind of sixth sense," Peterson mused to Martha during their evening walks. "Yesterday I couldn't find my car keys anywhere. Blue just walked over to the kitchen counter and pawed at a magazine. Keys were underneath it." The dog's collection of buried objects grew larger and more organized. Peterson discovered that Blue had created what appeared to be a systematic arrangement in the backyard, different types of items buried in different areas, as if sorted by some criteria only the dog understood. During Sam's 8th year in prison, a new development attorney named Rebecca Martinez joined Sarah Beth Collins's firm. Martinez specialized in wrongful conviction cases and had heard about Sam's situation through legal channels. She was particularly intrigued by the inconsistencies in the original investigation. "The timeline doesn't add up," Martinez explained to Collins during their first meeting about the case. "The 911 call reporting gunshots came in at 9:47 p.m. Dr. Mitchell was found at the scene at 10:15 p.m., still working on the injured dogs. That's only 28 minutes to commit murder, dispose of a weapon in a creek half a mile away, and return to provide medical care to animals." Collins nodded grimly. I raised that during the original trial, but the prosecution argued he could have made the trip in that time frame if he'd run. Did anyone test that theory? Actually time how long it would take to get from the warehouse to the creek and back? No. And I didn't have the resources to conduct that kind of investigation myself. Martinez began quietly working on the case pro bono, but every lead seemed to hit a wall. Witnesses changed their stories or disappeared entirely. Evidence that might have supported Sam's innocence had been lost or destroyed. The medical examiner, Dr. Reynolds, had retired and moved to Florida, claiming his health prevented him from discussing old cases. Meanwhile, Chief Morrison's career continued to flourish. He'd been promoted twice and was being mentioned as a potential candidate for sheriff. His public image was that of a dedicated lawman who'd overcome the tragedy of his father's murder to serve his community with distinction. But Blue's behavior suggested a different truth. During one particularly memorable visit, Morrison had accompanied a state inspection team to the prison. Blue, who was in the visiting room with Sam at the time, had what could only be described as a complete breakdown. The dog howled, paced frantically, and repeatedly threw himself against the glass separating him from his master. "What's wrong with that animal?" Morrison demanded, his face flushed with annoyance. "He gets anxious sometimes," Henderson explained, though he was watching the scene with growing suspicion. "Maybe we should move to a different room." But changing rooms didn't help. Blue continued his agitated behavior until Morrison left the building entirely. Only then did the dog calm down, collapsing on the floor as if exhausted by some enormous emotional effort. "That dog knows something," Henderson confided to his girlfriend that evening. "I've been watching him for 3 years, and he only acts like that around one person." As Sam's 10th year in prison began, the appeals process had been exhausted. The Georgia Supreme Court had upheld his conviction, and the federal courts had declined to hear his case. Sarah Beth Collins, now a partner in her firm, continued to visit Sam regularly, but they both knew the legal options were running out. "I'm sorry, Sam," she said during one of their meetings. "Unless we find new evidence, something that definitively proves your innocence, there's nothing more I can do through official channels." Sam nodded, his face calm despite the gravity of the situation. At 51, he'd found a kind of peace in prison, teaching literacy classes to fellow inmates and caring for the facility's small garden. But he never stopped thinking about Blue, never stopped worrying about what would happen to his loyal companion when the inevitable day arrived. Blue, now 12 years old and apparently completely blind, continued his mysterious routines. Dr. Peterson had long since stopped trying to understand the dog's behavior, accepting it as another of life's inexplicable mysteries. The buried objects had become a neighborhood legend, with local children daring each other to dig in the crazy dog's treasure yard. But Henderson, who'd been promoted to senior guard and had access to more areas of the prison, was beginning to piece together a different picture. He'd started paying attention to Blue's reactions to different people, noting patterns that others missed. The dog wasn't just randomly agitated. His responses were specific, targeted, and consistent. During Sam's 13th year, Henderson made a decision that would change everything. He began keeping a detailed log of Blue's behavior, documenting every visit, every reaction, every instance of the dog's seemingly supernatural awareness. What he discovered would eventually help crack open the biggest case of police corruption in Millfield County's history. But first, they would all have to survive the darkest period yet to come. August 15th, 2023. The day that would change everything began like any other Tuesday at Georgia State Penitentiary. The summer heat pressed down on the concrete walls like a suffocating blanket, and the air conditioning struggled against the oppressive humidity that made even the guards irritable. Sam Mitchell had been awake since 4 a.m., as was his habit. At 52, 15 years of incarceration had carved deep lines into his face. but his eyes still held the same gentle intelligence that had once made him one of the most respected veterinarians in Millfield County. He spent the pre-dawn hours in prayer and reflection, preparing his mind for what he knew might be his final day on earth. The call from Warden Crawford came at 8:30 a.m. "Mitchell, you need to report to my office immediately." Sam walked the familiar corridors one last time, past the library where he'd taught dozens of inmates to read, past the workshop where he'd helped repair furniture for local charities, past the garden where he'd coaxed vegetables from the stubborn Georgia clay. The other inmates watched him pass with respectful silence. In 15 years, Sam had never had a single disciplinary action on his record. Even the hardest criminals respected the quiet dignity with which he'd faced his situation. Crawford's office was a study in institutional functionality. Metal desk, filing cabinets, and a single window that looked out onto the exercise yard. The warden, a fair man who'd overseen the prison for 8 years, struggled with what he had to do. "Sam, I've got the final order from the court. All appeals have been exhausted. The execution is scheduled for 6 p.m. today." Sam nodded calmly. He'd been expecting this news for months. "I understand, Warden. I appreciate everything you've done to make my time here as bearable as possible. Is there anything you need? Any final arrangements you want to make?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the cloudless sky. "There is one thing. I'd like to see my dog one more time. Blue. He's been my family for 15 years, and I just want to say goodbye." Crawford frowned. In 30 years of corrections work, he'd never received such a request. "Sam, you know that's not standard protocol. The regulations don't really provide for—" "I've never asked for anything in 15 years, Sam interrupted gently. "No special privileges, no favors, nothing. This is the only thing I'll ever ask for." The sincerity in Sam's voice was undeniable. Crawford had watched this man face his fate with more grace than many free citizens showed facing minor inconveniences. If this was his final request, perhaps it deserved consideration. "Let me make some calls," Crawford said finally. "I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do." The news spread through the prison like wildfire. Guards whispered in corridors, inmates gathered in small groups, and even the kitchen staff seemed subdued. There was something profoundly moving about a condemned man's final wish being so simple, so pure. Tommy Ray Henderson was working a double shift and heard the news when he reported for duty at 2 p.m. For 5 years, he'd watched the bond between Sam and Blue during their weekly visits. He'd also kept his detailed log of Blue's behavioral patterns, though he'd never shared his observations with anyone. The dog's consistent reaction to Chief Morrison had convinced Henderson that something was deeply wrong with the original investigation. "Warden's trying to arrange for the dog to visit," another guard told Henderson as they changed shifts. "Seems like a decent thing to do for a man about to die." Henderson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If Blue was coming to the prison today, and if Chief Morrison was planning to attend the execution as he'd done for other high-profile cases, the dog's reaction might finally reveal the truth that Henderson had suspected for years. Dr. Peterson received the call at 3:15 p.m. His hands shook as he hung up the phone and looked down at Blue, who was sleeping peacefully in his favorite sunny spot by the clinic window. The old dog had been more listless than usual for the past week, as if sensing that something momentous was approaching. "Martha," Peterson called to his wife, "they want Blue at the prison. Sam's execution is tonight, and they're allowing a final visit." Martha Peterson had been caring for Blue almost as long as her husband, and she understood the profound bond between the dog and his imprisoned master. "That poor animal," she whispered, kneeling beside Blue and stroking his grayed muzzle. "He's been waiting 15 years for Sam to come home." Blue's eyes opened at the mention of Sam's name. Despite his apparent blindness, the dog's head turned toward Peterson with unmistakable alertness. It was a reaction Peterson had observed countless times over the years. Blue might not be able to see, but he seemed to understand every word spoken about his master. Loading Blue into the veterinary transport vehicle was easier than expected. The dog, now 15 years old and moving stiffly with arthritis, seemed to sense the importance of this journey. He settled into his traveling crate without his usual anxiety, his clouded eyes focused on something only he could see. The drive to the prison took 45 minutes through the August heat. Peterson kept glancing in his rearview mirror at Blue, who sat perfectly still except for an occasional tremor that ran through his aging body. The dog hadn't eaten in 2 days, and Peterson wondered if Blue somehow understood that this would be their final trip together. News vans were already gathering outside the prison gates when Peterson arrived. Word of Sam's unusual final request had leaked to the media, and reporters were treating it as a human interest story, the touching tale of a condemned man's love for his loyal companion. Peterson grimaced at the carnival atmosphere. These people had no idea what Blue had endured, what he'd witnessed, or what he might still reveal. Chief Morrison arrived at the prison at 4:30 p.m. in his official police vehicle, bringing with him 2 junior officers and a sense of authority that made everyone step aside. At 58, Morrison had aged well, his silver hair and commanding presence giving him the look of a man born to lead. He'd attended dozens of executions over the years, claiming it was his duty to see justice done for victims' families. But Henderson noticed something different about Morrison today. The chief seemed nervous, checking his watch frequently and avoiding eye contact with the other officials. When Henderson mentioned that Sam's dog would be visiting, Morrison's reaction was telling. "That animal shouldn't be here," Morrison said sharply. "This is a place of justice, not a petting zoo." "It's the man's final request," Henderson replied carefully. "Seems like a small mercy for someone about to die." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Henderson filed the reaction away in his mental log, another piece of evidence in a puzzle he was still trying to solve. At 5:15 p.m., Blue was led through the prison's security checkpoints for the last time. The dog moved slowly but purposefully, his nose working constantly to process the familiar scents of the institution that had become part of his weekly routine for 15 years. Guards who had watched Blue grow old during his visits stopped their conversations to watch him pass, many of them feeling an unexpected emotional weight. The visiting room had been specially prepared for this final meeting. The usual metal chairs and tables had been rearranged to create a more intimate space, and Warden Crawford had even allowed for the glass partition to be removed so that Sam and Blue could have physical contact for the first time in 15 years. When Sam entered the room in his prison jumpsuit, his movements careful but dignified, Blue's transformation was immediate and miraculous. The dog that had seemed listless and aged suddenly came alive, his body trembling with excitement and his clouded eyes somehow focusing directly on his master's face. "Blue," Sam whispered, dropping to his knees as the dog rushed toward him. "Oh, my good boy, my faithful friend." The reunion was witnessed by a dozen prison officials, several guards, and Dr. Peterson, but the room fell completely silent as man and dog embraced. Blue pressed against Sam's chest, whimpering with joy and relief, while Sam buried his face in the dog's grayed fur and wept openly for the first time in 15 years. "I'm so sorry, boy," Sam murmured. "I'm sorry I had to leave you. I'm sorry I couldn't come home." But as the emotional reunion continued, Blue began exhibiting the strange behaviors that had puzzled Dr. Peterson for years. The dog started moving around the room with purpose, sniffing at corners and doorways, his nose working frantically as if searching for something specific. It was then that Chief Morrison made his fatal mistake. He entered the visiting room to observe the proceedings, claiming official interest in the case that had made his career. The moment Blue caught Morrison's scent, everything changed. The moment Chief Morrison stepped into the visiting room, Blue's entire demeanor transformed from joy to something primal and terrifying. The 15-year-old German shepherd, who moments before had been a gentle, aging companion, suddenly became a creature possessed by fury. His hackles rose like a steel brush, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth yellowed with age, but still sharp enough to tear flesh, and a growl emerged from deep in his chest that made every person in the room step backward. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the guards, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "What's gotten into that dog?" Sam, still kneeling beside Blue, placed a protective hand on the dog's neck. He could feel the tremors of rage running through Blue's body, the same tension he'd felt that terrible night 15 years ago when Morrison's father had threatened them both. "Easy, boy," Sam murmured, but his own eyes had gone cold as winter steel. "I see him too." Morrison tried to maintain his composure, but his face had gone pale beneath his tan. "That animal is dangerous. It should be restrained immediately." "Blue's never hurt anyone in his life," Dr. Peterson said firmly, though he was as shocked as everyone else by the dog's reaction. "In 15 years, I've never seen him show aggression toward any person." Blue began moving toward Morrison with deliberate, measured steps. Despite his apparent blindness, the dog navigated the room as if he could see perfectly, his gaze locked on the police chief with laser-like intensity. Morrison backed toward the door, his hand moving instinctively to his service weapon. "Keep that animal away from me," Morrison demanded, his voice rising with something that sounded suspiciously like panic. "Why?" Tommy Ray Henderson asked quietly from his position by the door. "Why would a blind old dog scare a seasoned police officer?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Morrison's eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but found only curious and increasingly suspicious faces staring back at him. Blue's behavior became even more agitated. He began pacing between Morrison and a specific corner of the visiting room, whining and barking in short, sharp bursts. To the humans present, it seemed like random anxiety, but Sam recognized the pattern. It was the same behavior Blue had exhibited that night at the warehouse, trying to show Sam something important that his human companion couldn't understand. "He's trying to tell us something," Sam said, rising slowly to his feet. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Blue's been trying to tell people the truth for 15 years, but nobody speaks dog." Morrison's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. I won't stand here and listen to some convicted murderer claim his pet is solving crimes." "That dog is obviously senile and confused." "Confused about what?" Henderson pressed, his years of careful observation suddenly clicking into place. "What would confuse him about you specifically, Chief Morrison?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Warden Crawford stepped forward, his instincts telling him that something significant was happening, though he couldn't quite grasp what it was. "Maybe we should call off this visit," Crawford suggested. "The dog is clearly distressed and we're running close to the scheduled time." "No," Sam said firmly. "Blue's not distressed. He's trying to communicate. Look at him." Blue had positioned himself between Morrison and the corner of the room, his body language protective rather than aggressive. The dog was guarding something, or trying to lead someone to something, just as he'd done countless times over the years when Dr. Peterson had lost his keys or glasses. Morrison made a crucial error in judgment. Instead of simply leaving the room, which would have ended the confrontation, he decided to assert his authority. "I've had enough of this nonsense. Guard Henderson, I want that animal sedated and removed immediately." Henderson didn't move. "With respect, Chief, this isn't your jurisdiction. The warden runs this facility." Morrison's face flushed red with anger and what was becoming obvious fear. I'm ordering you as your superior officer. You're not my superior officer, Henderson interrupted calmly. I work for the Department of Corrections, not the Millfield Police Department. And right now I'm more interested in why a 15-year-old dog is acting like he's cornered a criminal. The word criminal seemed to hit Morrison like a physical blow. His hand moved more definitively toward his gun, and suddenly the room was charged with a different kind of danger. "Carl," Dr. Peterson said softly, using Morrison's first name for the first time in years. "Why don't you just leave? The dog will calm down once you're gone." But Morrison couldn't leave, and everyone in the room began to understand why. A guilty man running from a dog would look exactly like what it was, an admission of guilt. Morrison was trapped by his own need to maintain the facade he'd built over 15 years. Blue suddenly did something that shocked everyone present. He walked directly to Morrison and sat down at the police chief's feet, looking up at him with those clouded eyes that somehow seemed to see straight through to the man's soul. The dog's aggression had transformed into something else, a patient, watchful waiting that was somehow more unnerving than his earlier fury. "Get him away from me," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why?" Sam asked, stepping closer. "What are you afraid of, Morrison? What does Blue know that you don't want him to show us?" Morrison's breathing became rapid and shallow. 15 years of guilt, 15 years of looking over his shoulder, 15 years of wondering when the truth would finally surface. It was all collapsing around him in a prison visiting room with a dying man and his loyal dog. "This is insane," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm leaving." He turned toward the door, but Blue moved to block his path. The dog didn't growl or show aggression, but his presence was immovable, like a furry sentinel guarding the gates of justice. "Blue, down," Sam commanded gently. The dog looked back at his master, then at Morrison, then made a decision that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Blue walked to that corner of the room he'd been protecting and began to dig at the concrete floor with his claws, whining and barking with increasing urgency. "What's he doing?" Crawford asked, mesmerized by the dog's behavior. Henderson knelt down beside Blue and examined the floor where the dog was digging. "There's something different about this section. The concrete looks newer, like it was patched." Morrison's face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. "You're all insane. This is a 15-year-old building with normal wear and repair." But Henderson was running his fingers along the floor, and what he found made his blood run cold. "This patch is maybe 10, 12 years old, and there's something buried underneath it." The room erupted in chaos. Morrison lunged for the door, but Henderson was faster, stepping into his path. Dr. Peterson was on his radio calling for additional security, while Warden Crawford tried to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's comprehension. "Move away from that door, Henderson," Morrison commanded, his hand now resting on his weapon. "That's an order." "No, sir," Henderson replied calmly. "I think we need to see what that dog found." Sam knelt beside Blue, his heart breaking as he finally understood what his faithful companion had been trying to tell the world for 15 years. "Good boy, Blue, good boy. You never forgot, did you?" The old dog looked up at his master with eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow and patience in the world. For 15 years, Blue had been waiting for this moment, carrying the burden of truth that no one else could bear witness to. At 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Sam Mitchell was scheduled to die for a crime he didn't commit, the truth finally began to surface from beneath a patch of concrete that a guilty man had hoped would hide his secrets forever. The maintenance crew arrived within minutes, their jackhammers and concrete saws cutting through 15 years of Morrison's carefully constructed lies. Blue sat beside the excavation site with the patience of a saint, his clouded eyes fixed on the police chief who stood cornered like a rat in a trap. "This is ridiculous," Morrison kept repeating, but his voice had lost all authority. Sweat poured down his face despite the air conditioning, and his hands trembled as he watched the concrete crumble away. "You're destroying state property based on the whims of a senile dog." Henderson ignored him, directing the workers with the methodical precision of a man who'd finally found the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been working on for years. When the jackhammer hit something metallic 18 inches down, the sound rang through the visiting room like a death knell. "Stop," Henderson commanded. "Hand tools from here." What they pulled from beneath the concrete made everyone in the room gasp. It was a small metal box, corroded but intact, wrapped in plastic that had kept most of the moisture out over the years. Inside the box was a treasure trove of evidence that would have freed Sam Mitchell on the first day of his trial. The first item was a .38 caliber revolver, not Sam's missing .45, but a smaller weapon that ballistics would later prove was the actual murder weapon. The gun was registered to Carl Morrison, reported stolen from his personal collection 3 days after his father's murder. "That's not mine," Morrison said automatically, but his voice was barely a whisper. "The registration says otherwise," Henderson replied, reading from the paperwork in the box. "Purchased by Carl Morrison, Millfield Police Department on March 15, 2006. But the gun was just the beginning. The box also contained photographs, dozens of them showing Frank Morrison's illegal dog fighting operation in graphic detail. The images were time-stamped and dated, spanning several months leading up to the murder. In many of the photos, a younger Carl Morrison was clearly visible, not as an investigating officer but as a participant in the criminal enterprise. Dr. Peterson examined the photographs with growing horror. "These dogs. Some of them are the same ones Sam was treating that night. Look, there's the German Shepherd that was so badly beaten." The final item in the box was perhaps the most damning. A handwritten confession, signed and dated October 14, 2008, the day after Frank Morrison's murder. The letter was addressed to no one and everyone, a guilty man's attempt to unburden his conscience. "I killed my father. God help me. I shot him in cold blood because he was going to expose our partnership in the dog fighting operation. When that veterinarian showed up and threatened to call the sheriff, Dad panicked. He was going to pin everything on me to save his own skin. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't go to prison. So I followed him after Dr. Mitchell left the first time, and I shot him with my backup piece. Then I went back to the scene and planted evidence to frame the vet. The dog saw everything, every goddamn thing. Sometimes I think that animal is going to testify against me in court. I buried this confession because I'm too much of a coward to face what I've done. But maybe someday the truth will come out. Maybe someday that dog will find a way to tell someone what really happened." The silence that followed Henderson's reading of the confession was deafening. Morrison had collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands, his career and life crumbling around him like the concrete they'd just destroyed. "You son of a bitch," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying more sadness than anger. 15 years. 15 years of my life and Blue's life, and all the lives you destroyed with your lies." Morrison looked up, his eyes red with tears and exhaustion. "You don't understand. My father was going to destroy me. He was going to tell everyone I was his partner in the dog fighting, that I'd been taking protection money. My career would have been over. So instead, you destroyed mine," Sam replied. "And you would have let me die tonight for your crimes." Blue had been sitting quietly throughout the revelations, but now he stood and walked slowly to Morrison. The dog's behavior was no longer aggressive or protective. It was almost pitying, as if he understood the depth of human weakness and forgiveness better than the humans around him. Morrison reached out tentatively to touch Blue's head, perhaps seeking some form of absolution from the creature he'd wronged so deeply. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God help me. I'm so sorry." Blue allowed the touch for a moment, then walked back to Sam's side. The dog's message was clear. Forgiveness was possible, but justice was still required. Warden Crawford was on his radio, halting the execution and calling for the governor's office, the attorney general, and every other official who needed to know that the state of Georgia had come within minutes of executing an innocent man. The visiting room had become a crime scene, with photographers documenting evidence that should have been found 15 years earlier. Tommy Ray Henderson felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow as he looked at his log book, filled with 5 years of careful observations about Blue's behavior. "I knew something was wrong," he told Dr. Peterson. "That dog never lied. Not once in all the years I watched him. People lie, evidence can be planted, witnesses can be bought, but a dog's instincts don't lie." "Doctor." Peterson knelt beside Blue, running his hands through the old dog's fur with wonder and respect. "How long have you been carrying this burden, boy? How long have you been trying to tell us the truth?" As if in answer, Blue walked to the corner where the evidence had been buried and lay down, finally at peace. For 15 years, he'd been guarding the truth, waiting for the moment when someone would finally listen to what he'd been trying to say. The media outside the prison went into overdrive when news of the discovery leaked. Within hours, the story was trending on social media with hashtags like #BlueTheHero and #DogSolvesCase. News vans from major networks began arriving from Atlanta and beyond, turning the small Georgia town into the center of a national conversation about justice, loyalty, and the bond between humans and animals. But inside the prison, Sam Mitchell sat on the floor beside his dog, both of them exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of the day. "You did it, boy," Sam whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You saved me. After all these years, you finally saved me." Morrison was led away in handcuffs, his confession having been recorded and witnessed by multiple officials. As he passed Sam and Blue, he stopped for a moment. "That dog is a better soul than I'll ever be," he said quietly. "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." Sam looked up at the man who'd stolen 15 years of his life. "I already have, Carl. Blue taught me that holding on to anger just poisons your own heart. But forgiveness doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences." Morrison nodded and allowed himself to be led away. He would later plead guilty to murder, evidence tampering, perjury, and a dozen other charges. The judge who sentenced him noted that if not for the intervention of a loyal dog, Morrison's crimes might never have been discovered. The legal machinery began working overtime to process Sam's release. Sarah Beth Collins, who had fought for his innocence for 15 years, cried openly as she signed the paperwork that would finally set her client free. Rebecca Martinez began preparing the wrongful conviction lawsuit that would eventually award Sam substantial compensation from the state. But as the sun set on August 15, 2023, Sam Mitchell wasn't thinking about money or lawsuits or media attention. He was thinking about the miracle of a dog's unwavering loyalty and how love can survive even the darkest circumstances. Blue's apparent blindness had been another layer of his protection strategy. By appearing disabled and harmless, he'd been able to gather evidence and information that might have been denied to a healthy, alert dog. His intelligence had been evident to those who paid attention, but most people saw only what they expected to see, an aging pet grieving for his master. As the visiting room finally emptied of officials and investigators, Sam was granted permission to spend the night with Blue in a special holding area. They would both leave the prison as free souls in the morning, their bond stronger than ever after surviving the ultimate test of loyalty and love. "Thank you, Blue," Sam whispered as his faithful companion finally relaxed beside him. "Thank you for never giving up on the truth." The old dog's tail wagged weakly, and for the first time in 15 years, both man and animal slept peacefully, knowing that justice had finally been served by the most unlikely of heroes. Dawn broke over Georgia State Penitentiary on August 16, 2023, painting the concrete walls in shades of gold and hope that Sam Mitchell hadn't seen in 15 years. He woke to find Blue curled against his side, the old dog's breathing steady and peaceful for the first time since their reunion. Outside the holding room window, Sam could see news vans lined up like a parade, their satellite dishes reaching toward a sky that no longer seemed like a ceiling, but a promise of infinite possibilities. Warden Crawford appeared at 7 a.m. with paperwork, a small smile creasing his weathered face. "Well, Sam, it looks like you're finally going home." The release process took 3 hours, 15 years of incarceration reduced to signatures on forms and the return of personal effects that had been stored since 2008. Sam's wallet still contained the same $23 he'd had when arrested, along with a photo of Blue as a young dog that had somehow survived the bureaucratic maze of the prison system. Dr. Peterson arrived with his truck at 10:15 a.m., his eyes red from crying and exhaustion. "That dog of yours," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "In 40 years of veterinary practice, I've seen some remarkable animals, but Blue, he's something else entirely." Blue seemed to understand that this departure was different from all the others. Instead of the resignation he'd shown during previous visits, the dog exhibited an energy that belied his 15 years. His tail wagged constantly, and he kept looking between Sam and the exit as if to confirm that they were truly leaving together. The walk to freedom took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Sam counted every step. When the final security door opened and Georgia sunshine hit his face, he dropped to his knees and buried his face in Blue's fur, both of them overwhelmed by the reality of their situation. "We're free, boy," Sam whispered. "We're finally free." The media crush was overwhelming but respectful. Reporters shouted questions about everything from Sam's feelings about Morrison to his plans for the future. But Sarah Beth Collins had prepared him for this moment. He walked to the microphones with Blue beside him, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. "I want to thank everyone who supported me during these 15 years, Sam said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "But most of all, I want to thank Blue. This dog never stopped believing in the truth, never stopped fighting for justice, and never stopped loving me even when the whole world said I was guilty. If there's a hero in this story, it's not me, it's him." The questions came rapid fire, but Sam deflected most of them gracefully. When asked about his feelings toward Morrison, he paused thoughtfully. "I forgive Carl Morrison," he said finally. "Hatred is a poison that destroys the vessel that contains it. Blue taught me that love and loyalty are stronger than anger and revenge." A young reporter from CNN pushed forward. "Dr. Mitchell, what's next for you and Blue?" Sam smiled, the first genuine smile many people had seen from him in 15 years. "We're going home. We're going to live quietly, take care of each other, and maybe help some other folks who've been dealt a bad hand by life. That's what Blue would want." The drive to Dr. Peterson's house took 45 minutes through the Georgia countryside that Sam hadn't seen as a free man since 2008. Everything seemed both familiar and foreign. New shopping centers where farmland used to be. Old landmarks, weathered by time and neglect. Blue sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, drinking in scents and sounds he'd been denied during their weekly prison visits. Martha Peterson had prepared a welcome home meal that could have fed half the county. The dining room table groaned under the weight of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and 3 different kinds of pie. It was more food than Sam had seen in one place since his last free meal in 2008. "Bless his heart," Martha said, watching Sam try to process the abundance. 15 years of prison food. We'll have you back to fighting weight in no time." But Sam was more interested in watching Blue explore the house where he'd lived for 15 years. The dog moved through the rooms with familiarity, checking his favorite sleeping spots and investigating the backyard where he'd buried his mysterious treasures. It struck Sam that Blue had built a whole life during their separation, had formed relationships and routines that sustained him through their forced separation. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, neighbors who'd followed the case, former colleagues from Sam's veterinary practice, and old friends who'd never stopped believing in his innocence. Each person had a story about Blue, how the dog had helped them find a lost cat, how he'd somehow known when their grandmother was dying, how he'd provided comfort during difficult times without being asked. "That dog's got more sense than most people I know," said Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the same woman who'd called Sam about the injured dogs 15 years earlier. "When he showed up at my door during that thunderstorm last spring, I knew something was wrong. Sure enough, my husband was having a heart attack upstairs. Blue saved Harold's life by getting me to check on him." As the sun began to set, the visitors gradually departed, leaving Sam, Blue, and the Petersons alone on the front porch. The old dog lay contentedly at Sam's feet, occasionally lifting his head to accept gentle pats from his master's hand. "What will you do now?" Dr. Peterson asked, settling into his rocking chair with a glass of sweet tea. Sam was quiet for a long moment, watching fireflies begin their evening dance in the gathering dusk. "I've been thinking about that for 15 years, he said finally. "I want to help other people who've been wrongfully convicted. There are folks sitting in prison right now, innocent as the day they were born, with nobody fighting for them. Maybe Blue and I can make a difference." Within 6 months, the Blue Foundation was established with funding from Sam's wrongful conviction settlement and donations that poured in from around the world. The foundation's mission was simple: provide legal assistance and investigative resources to prisoners who might be innocent but lack the means to prove it. Blue became the unofficial mascot and inspiration for the organization. Despite his advanced age, the dog seemed energized by having a purpose again. He would accompany Sam to meetings with attorneys, visits to prisons, and conferences about criminal justice reform. Wherever they went, Blue's presence reminded people that loyalty, perseverance, and love could overcome even the greatest injustices. The documentary about their story, titled "Truth Has Four Legs," won 3 Emmy Awards and sparked nationwide conversations about the reliability of criminal investigations and the power of the human-animal bond. Blue's story became required viewing in criminal justice courses at universities across the country. But for Sam and Blue, the real victory wasn't the fame or the foundation or the legal reforms their case inspired. It was the simple pleasure of being together again, of sleeping in the same room, of sharing meals and walks and quiet moments that had been denied to them for 15 years. On Christmas morning 2023, Sam woke to find Blue standing by the window, watching snow fall gently on the Georgia countryside. The dog's tail was wagging slowly, and he turned to look at Sam with eyes that still held all the love and loyalty they'd carried for 15 years. "Merry Christmas, boy," Sam said, kneeling beside his faithful companion. "Thank you for giving me back my life." Blue licked Sam's face once, then settled down beside him to watch the snow. They sat together in comfortable silence, 2 souls who had weathered the storm and found their way home to each other. 6 months later, Blue passed away peacefully in his sleep, his head resting on Sam's feet as it had every night since their reunion. Sam buried him in the backyard where the dog had spent 15 years guarding the truth, under a simple stone marker that read, "Blue, loyal friend, seeker of truth, guardian of justice." The Blue Foundation continued its work, helping to free 17 wrongfully convicted individuals in its first 3 years. Each time an innocent person walked out of prison, Sam would visit Blue's grave and tell his old friend about another victory for truth and justice. "You started something beautiful, boy," Sam would whisper to the stone. "Your legacy lives on in every life we save, every family we reunite, every truth we uncover." As the sun set on another day of freedom, Sam Mitchell sat on his porch and reflected on the miracle of a dog's unwavering faith. Blue had taught him that love doesn't end with death, that loyalty transcends time and circumstance, and that sometimes the most profound truths come from the purest hearts. In the distance, a young German shepherd barked once, and Sam smiled, knowing that somewhere, somehow, Blue was still watching over him, still guarding the truth, still proving that the bond between a man and his dog is stronger than any injustice the world can devise. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't between two people. They're between a soul and their faithful companion who never stops believing in them. Sam and Blue's journey reminds us that in our golden years, when the world sometimes feels like it's moving too fast and leaving us behind, the bonds we've built with those who truly know us become our greatest treasures. Blue waited 15 years, never losing faith, never giving up hope that truth would prevail and love would triumph. How many of us have been blessed with that kind of unwavering loyalty? Whether it's from a beloved pet who greets us at the door every day, a spouse who's weathered life's storms beside us, or children who still call just to hear our voice, these connections are what make our lives rich with meaning. Blue's story teaches us that it's never too late for justice, never too late for new beginnings, and never too late to discover that the love we've given comes back to us in ways we never expected. At 55, 60, or 68, our most beautiful chapters might still be waiting to be written. What loyal companion has been your Blue through life's challenges? Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal seemed to understand you better than most people? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about the faithful friends who've touched your heart.